Okay, so let's go in order. Let's go through some of these. Let's start with the first question. The question was Chakira versus Emunah Peshuta. Chakira is philosophical speculation, philosophical investigation, proofs and arguments to the existence of God. And Emunah Peshuta is often translated as blind faith, which is a mistranslation, because blind faith, first of all, no word in Emunah Peshuta means blind faith. It's not even clear if the word Emunah should be translated as faith. I'll come to that soon, what it is and what it isn't. But Peshuta certainly means straightforward. It doesn't mean blind. So let's go back over the word Emunah. Let's identify what Emunah Peshuta is. Let's identify what Chakira is, and let's talk a bit about the history of these and then our day. So the word faith in English can mean lots of things. Sometimes it means a religion, a faith. Sometimes it means a real strong connection to God, which I'm going to talk about soon, but often it's taken to mean that which you take on faith, meaning that which you have no rational grounds to believe at all. People often distinguish faith, belief, and knowledge. People mean different things by those terms, but faith might often mean things where there is zero grounds for it, except an emotional desire. Belief might be something where there's a little more basis for it, and knowledge will be something where I don't have an ability to doubt it, let's say. So those are kind of the different things we talk about. If we talk about faith in that sense, then Judaism doesn't have such a concept. It doesn't have a concept of just guess it's true, or just follow it only because your parents did so, or something like that. The word emunah in Hebrew doesn't mean that, and that's evident from its usage in the Torah. Now, where does the word emunah come up? So, for example, with Avraham Avinu, Hashem tells Avraham, you're going to have children. And the Pasuk says, Vayamin b'Hashem, which can't mean he had faith in God in the sense of he wanted it to be true. He had this heroic leap. You know, that's often the word we use with faith, the leap of faith. Because in that context, Hashem just appeared to him and told him. If God tells you something's going to happen, who's the most powerful thing able to generate whatever he wants to, you don't have any doubt that it's going to happen. So faith there, emunah there, does not mean faith in the ordinary usage of the English sentence, if that sentence means a leap and blind and all that kind of other stuff. Another example is Moshe Rabbeinu in the war against Amalek. He has to go up the mountain, and it says, Vehi yodov emunah. His hands were, the word there can't mean faith. It's not even referring to a cognitive state per se. And it's clear, and many people point out, I don't even know who'd be the first to point it out, the word emunah in Hebrew, in the Torah, means faithful. When Avram is faithful to the information that God's given him, it comes with a commitment. How is he going to raise the child? When Moshe's hands, they're faithful. It's true to what you know. In other words, after you know something is the case, there is a struggle around it very often. How can I live up to it? How can I stay true to that which I know is right? There's temptation, there's reasons, there's struggle, there's all these various things. That's what emunah is. So what is Emunah Peshuta? Emunah Peshuta is direct sense of this faithfulness with God, and the assumption is that human beings naturally have some kind of concept of this that comes from, if you like, our soul or some deeper intuition or something that would explain why human societies, as far as we can tell, in all the societies that have developed anywhere on earth, never really developed a purely atheistic society. It takes a lot of work to do that, right? Humans naturally have a sense there's more to life. Humans naturally have an intuition, there's meaning, there's spirituality. Now, once their brains try to translate that consciously, they may come up with lots of different ideas. But the principle that there's something behind existence, that we're not the beginning and end of existence, that there's something that conveys meaning to our existence, something we're accountable to, and all that is instinctive and natural. And you would go even further and say that without too much thought, the idea that that thing is not physical, the idea that thing made the physical universe because the universe can't have been around forever, all these sorts of things are so intuitive and instinctive, it's not, I would say more than that, it's not even coming from that. I at the end just introduced a bit of an intellectual process. Even without that, if we are the thoughts of God thinking us into existence, then it is accessible within us to be aware of that. That's the principle of Emunah Peshuta. And intuitive and instinctive, and if we don't block it, and we don't do something to actively interfere with that process, it will be natural. That's the theory of Emunah Peshuta. That's something we see. The Rosh talks about it. The Rashba at some point. We see, it's talked about already in the era of the medieval of the Rishonim. The Rosh seems to indicate that in Ashkenaz there was almost no philosophical work being done. There was all this natural sense that was powerful enough and compelling enough that people were giving their lives for this. At that point in history, many, many Jews and Jewish communities had been slaughtered for being Jewish already. You had the Crusades, you had all this stuff. And people, it was clear, it was clear it's true, and there didn't need to be more to it. Chakira is another angle. This crops up, as far as we can tell in the writings, probably in the late Gaonic period. The first writing you have Rav Sadia Gaon, and then very much, and that's in Babylonia, that's happening. And then later on in Spain, the Chovas HaLevavos, the Rambam, and others are engaging in the world of philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Why is that? Probably because the world was already starting to shift away from pure paganism and pure idolatry towards ideas of the Greeks, which were very philosophical. The Muslim world, when it spread monotheism throughout the Arabian Peninsula, was now starting to wrestle with all of this stuff because they had preserved Greek teachings. They were preserved, the European world had effectively lost them. The Byzantine teachers had moved across, and now it was really the Library of Baghdad and these places where they're really grappling with the Greek ideas. And suddenly there's a rational basis for doubting God's existence, or at least doubting the type of God that we're talking about, what we're referring to in the Torah, and what God who intervenes, who cares, who's aware of what's happening, and it matters to him what's happening. That stuff the Aristotelians were not into. So now you have a whole dialogue and debate going on, and now you have a very important work called Chakira. But it turns out that one of the positives of it is it can give you a lot more clarity, a lot more certainty, a lot more removal of doubt around these central important concepts. So what you really had is that in the, if you like, Golus Yishmael, in the exile in the Islamic world, there was an enormous amount of work happening. The Rishonim, the medieval great rabbis of us, the Rambam, and all this, they're really wrestling with this stuff and producing some first-class works of their own in this field, in this area. The European, the Ashkenazi world, the Golus Edom, if you like, that is free from this, because the alternative systems at the time, the Christian world was not really wrestling with all this stuff, so nobody was really doubting the concept that there's a God. There was the automatic sense of it's true was obvious to everybody. And now the question really was, the debate between us and the Christian world was largely around whether the Torah was still valid or not. That didn't really have much to do with and Jews, I don't think, ever felt very compelled by the idea that God's rejected the Torah when the Torah itself seems to say it will never reject it. So that was what was going on, and that allowed a different benefit. And the benefit is that the following, and this really comes to the fore later on in history. I'll tell you what the benefit is soon. I'll tell you the benefit now. The primary benefit is that philosophical arguments can get you lost in the following, that God becomes an abstract end of a line of proof, which is not a very personal way of connecting to Hashem. And it can sometimes, too much emphasis on the philosophical has two potential weaknesses. One is that it doesn't leave you in a living relationship with God. And two is that it's always susceptible to somebody coming up with a new piece of information or a new argument that will take you a few centuries to work through properly. And if your whole faith is based, if you've lost track of the direct connection, then you're much more vulnerable to something sounding very clever coming along, or somebody sounding very convincing coming along that could shake it. That's kind of the worry on the other side. This really hit a big peak, I would say, in the late 18th century in Europe. Because with the Enlightenment, you'd had David Hume, especially Immanuel Kant, who was a great German philosopher, who many say begins modern philosophy. And in his critique of pure reason, although he himself believed in God, he basically got to the point where arguments for and against the existence of God are so abstract and so difficult, and you can kind of prove things either way, and really human reason can't go as far as this sort of abstract thing, and kind of left us in a philosophical agnosticism, if you like. You can't, it's not that it's irrational to believe in God because there's good arguments for, but it's not that it's compelling because there's good arguments against. So we're kind of, something's going on, we don't know what, somewhere there's infinities all over the place, we don't know how. Let's pause there. And what happened was that for many Jews, who were coming out of the at various points, coming out of the villages and the shtetls and moving into the cities over the next 2.5 centuries. They had the same experience. They turned up in these universities, or they turned up in these enlightened cities, and there's like the village was where people who are primitive, who never had running water and electricity, and owned one item of clothing and blew their nose in their sleeve and spoke Yiddish and ate herring and believed in God, were there, and they kind of all lumped together. And then the people in the enlightened world, where we have electricity and telegrams, and we wear lots of clothes, and we don't just we're enlightened, and we know about Bach and Beethoven and Kant and whatever, and we're the elites of the world, and of course we ditch religion. It was kind of all thrown together. So between that and the kind of Kantian intellectual critique of all this, you had a world where it didn't seem that holding our own was something we could do on terms of the non-Jewish world. At the same time, you had a massive revivalist movement going on across Europe, which was the Hasidic movement, which was, especially after the depressing, going back to the 17th century, the double tragedy of the Tachvatat, of the Khmelnytsky massacres, and the Jews having been slaughtered across Eastern Europe, and then along with Poles as well. It wasn't just Jews who got slaughtered, but for us that was the traumatic devastation, and then the false Messiah, the Shabtai Tzvi, and the whole disaster of that world, and basically the Talmidei Chachamim retreated into real deep learning Torah, and a lot of the masses kind of became cynical, lost hope, didn't see where the end of the exile could be coming from, didn't trust Kabbalah, didn't trust rabbis, and didn't believe, is Mashiach going to come? And along came this awakening of the Hasidic world, and the Hasidic world spoke about the deep connection every Jew can have to God. Even if you're not very learned, even if you're not very scholarly, forget whether you know philosophy, even if you're not a big Talmud Chacham, that God is so close to you and literally thinking you into existence, that you're there with God. You don't need to speculate your way around stuff. It's so present. And within the Hasidic world began to become, in certain sects of it, almost a Hakira, this philosophical stuff is just bad news. Just get rid of it all. Forget it. Let's just go direct to the source, go straight to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Inside you, when you're reaching out to him, you'll know it's true. And you don't need to doubt all this stuff. God lives with us with such a tangible presence. All we have to do is open ourselves up to it. And that's, if you like, became a very dominant way of thinking for the last few hundred years, I would say. Not just in the Hasidic world, but that was a big driver of it. So that's the basic history of things. In our generation, it varies from person to person. And it varies sometimes from decade to decade. To the extent to which there is a often cynical attack on religion as blind and irrational, and it makes people doubt what's going on, there's a very strong place for philosophically grounding the beliefs that we have. And in a world where it's a free market of ideas, it makes sense to have that available for people who are investigating and looking for it. At the same time, I think each person has their own pathway to find Hashem, an own pathway in there for some people and for some communities and for some types of people. Instinctively, it's so instinctive, it's like unshakable. What do you mean God doesn't exist? That's ridiculous. I'm existentially aware of it at the core of my being. And there's no particular obvious benefit to engaging arguments about that. You don't need to argue that you exist. You don't need to argue that somebody you love exists. But others have a very different natural instinct, which is actually I'm more naturally skeptical and questioning, and maybe I doubt my own intuitive feelings, and there's so many other views out there, and there's so many intelligent people who have different views, and I've heard this argument and that argument, in which case there's a very important role for these arguments. I think the old classical arguments are almost all still as valid as they ever were, just they need to sometimes be reframed. If they're framed in the language of medieval physics, you need to remove the medieval physics and see does the argument still remain. Some do, some don't, but lots of them do. And so you kind of get to the more abstract versions of these arguments. What about Torah min hashamayim? That's something we've got to really deal with nowadays. Once upon a time, even the whole non-Jewish world believed in that. Today, a lot of people in the non-Jewish world don't. So these become much more valuable. So the short answer for today is I think there's different pathways for different individuals. I don't think there's a right pathway or wrong pathway. If somebody's going to do it, they have to do it well. Whichever pathway they embark on should be honest and with integrity. And a person shouldn't be deluding themselves over what arguments they're bought into, nor should they be deluding themselves over what's intuitive. But the purer we become, the more open it is for, in many cases, for the neshama just to shine through and be directly aware of God. And even if we use chakira, we use philosophical investigation, we have to also remember to go beyond it. Well, that means if I can philosophically prove that my wife exists and that she's very good for me to be married to, okay, but I've got to do the work of the relationship. right? You can't just leave it as a philosophical abstraction. If I could prove the Torah is from God, and I could prove the system's true, and I could prove God exists, fine. But life is about going beyond that into the relationship with God. So it's very good that we had many decades where we had that and built the deep roots of it, and then very good in many ways we have many decades and centuries where we push the other direction, because we probably need a bit of both of them too. Okay, if that answers. Great. What was our second question? Remind me. I'm sorry. Just we're going to get
angels. How do you
angel. Okay. Yeah. Good. So it's a great question, and it's a great. What are angels? How do we think about them? And the reason that's a particularly important question is because it's an example of something that occurs enormously in large parts of what we read. It's in Tanakh. It's all over Torah. Everyone gets visited by angels. Yaakov meets one, and Manoach meets one in Sefer Shoftim. But God talks about giving us an angel. It's in the Ma'aseh Merkava, right, in the chariot visions of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, of the 6th chapter of Yechezkel, already at the beginning, and then chapter 10. So we've got all this everywhere, and all over the Gemara, all over Chazals, all over the place. We say it every day in Kedusha, right? Korazel Zeva Amar Kodesh Kodesh Kodesh, right? We quote the chapters and we quote all the verses of the angels. What are angels? And the other reason it's a very important question is because it's a great example of something that in English language probably captures the wrong concept, right? So because of the history of the English language and various stages of the historical evolution of the language, it's very natural when you hear the word angel to think of a baby flapping around with wings, right? Like something out of a Renaissance painting or something. And that comes from over-physicalizing some of the descriptions of Yeshaya and Yechezkel. Probably the best analogy we have nowadays of conceiving what a malach is, right? Let's use the word malach, because malach literally means a messenger. You can have non-spiritual messengers too. And we also see the Gemaras again and again emphasizing that a malach can only do one task, to the point where they sometimes question God. God says split the sea, and they go, why? What's the difference between these and these? You're like, shut up and just do what God says. Why do you need to ask questions? Humans ask questions. Right? You're close to God, just do what he says. The answer is, I think, the best analogy we have for it is like an algorithm. The Gemara says, there's not a single blade of grass that will grow without a malach knocking it. That means that the world is being driven by a set of, in our current technological development, we'd use the metaphor of an algorithm, bunch of loads and loads of algorithms for everything that exists, algorithms for the way nations operate, for the way individuals operate, for the way everything in the universe operates. We have the universals that become particularized, we have objects and entities and laws, and all these things are driven by an underlying complex interactive program, except those algorithms are conscious to some degree, very close to God and right at the will of God, and therefore we call them kind of conscious algorithms. Now those algorithms can turn around if God says do something like save the good guys and don't let the bad guys through, and the algorithm can't pick up at the level at which it operates. It cannot detect what's the difference in Israel and Egypt at that point. At the level to which it functions, there was no difference. Our connection to God was higher than where they could operate. So that's where you can get a malach turning around and saying, God, I can't carry out your instruction, or doesn't this instruction lead to a malfunction, or something like that. So that's a way to conceive of malachim. Now the Rambam goes so far as to say a malach can never translate itself into the physical world. Every single episode of the malach, and this others follow the Radak, seems to go with this pathway too. The Radak generally follows the Rambam's view on the philosophical things. So seems to take the same line that every time they encounter a malach, it must be in a prophetic state, some kind of transcendent state, which has interesting consequences. It means that when Avram and Sarah both interact with the malach, they must have been sharing their transcendent state. Right? Or when Yaakov wrestles with the malach and comes out limping, or they destroy Sodom, there must be some way in which, even though you meet them in the transcendent state, they impact into this world still. Okay, that's fair enough. As you climb up to enter the world of the algorithms and interact, and then when you come back down into the world, there's a real result. Okay, but that's the Rambam's approach. The Ramban, in the beginning of Parashas Vayera, and others take a different approach. They say malach can crystallize into this world. It can take on a physical representative form and then interact with us physically too. One way or the other. One way or the other, I would say that's probably the most helpful way to understand what a malach is. And there's different levels of malach depending on how deep the algorithms go. The Rambam in the beginning of Hilchos Yesodei Torah, the second chapter really, already starts telling us about the different levels, and that's fair enough. That's how reality works. You have algorithms that generate algorithms and so on. Again, using our metaphor, could be in future technology, we'll have even better metaphors. That's probably the best that we have now. Yeah, Yosef.
As a follow-up to that, when you say that the angels are conscious, do you mean like they're made out of consciousness, like they're being thought into existence like we are, or do you mean that they themselves have like free will and can make decisions? Because like most computer scientists say, like even the most like advanced AI like can never be sentient or conscious. Because
yeah, so it's a good question. I think the sources we have on Malachim suggest the consciousness, but not a functional free will, because they're too close to the source. They're flowing with the will and consciousness of God, if you like. They have a sense of self. They're distanced from God enough that they have some sense of self, but not enough to mature into an active free will. Whether they have a hypothetical free will, maybe, but they're so flowing with the light of God, they can't in practice break God's will. That's what it means. They're too close to God to have an active free will. So, I mean, it sounds even sources are even jealous of us on some level, because we actually have a sense of self that's much richer than theirs, to the point where we can choose non-existence. And there's much more meaning in our choice to be close to God. And there's much more impact in what we can invite God into a space where God is somewhat absent. They can't. They can be conduits for the light to flow in when we've activated. When we call God's presence in, they can generate. And it's important to have these algorithms standing between us and God, because if all it was God shone his light, we just dissolve. So there have to be these kind of intermediary layers till we're ready to embrace the full consciousness of the existence of God. Yeah.
Why do the Christians get it so wrong in terms of like how they see it as sort of more of a free entity?
Well, first of all, when you say the Christians, you have to be very careful. Christianity is an enormous set of related religions that share some points in common. They can all be called Christianity. There are lots of different theological subsystems within them. I don't claim to be an expert on all of them, and therefore I would be a little reticent to say all Christians believe all X, Y, Z. So why do some faith systems out there believe angels have free will? There are even sources in Torah that suggest the possibility of angels having free will, fallen angels. Concepts like these are not impossible. As a general rule, we would, there is something that is possible that the early church was interacting a lot with Roman paganism too, and it is not impossible that certain ideas cross-correlated from the pantheon of gods into the world of angels. At the same time, I don't know enough Christian theology to know every theologian there interprets this particular bit, or they interpret the Malachim. I can't. But it's very easy for religion to make mistakes on deep theological areas, simply because even if you took all the Torah sources, or at least many of them, you can easily read mistakes into them. It's very, very easy. You need a whole Torah Shabbat, you need a whole world of study to line things, and even then there's sometimes debates exactly how to line everything up, right? The Maharal makes this point very often, that almost everything that's false in the world comes from a point that's true, and it's just a little distorted or a little seen through a certain prism here and there. So, but again, I would be very, very reticent to draw a blanket line across. Yeah?
How would you explain, or how would the Rambam explain, like actions that were done, like Avram fed the Malachim?
Right. So, okay, good. So if you're going to say that the Rambam, although the Rambam doesn't explicitly go through all this, but the Abar Ben-Nel has a piece defending the Rambam, the Ritva has a piece defending the Rambam, what they would argue is something like this. In a transcendent world, it's still parallel to things in this world. It's just deeper. So, for example, let's take a virtual reality world. Right? On whatever level you enter a virtual reality space, or even you're playing an arcade in an old whatever arcade game or something, we feel we're interacting with the screen or the graphics. You pull a thing here and your car goes this way or that way or the other way. Of course, that's not what's really going on. Is you're actually interacting with a program that you can't see running, and you're adding an input here, and it's now sending you to a loop over there, and then it's being translated back into a graphic screen. So there's two layers of reality co-occurring. There's the graphics, which you're interested in and interacting with, but there's the program, which is where things are actually happening more directly. And if you want to be more precise, there's probably even deeper than the program. That's a representation of units of information, bits and bytes, and ultimately just electrons. So you can define the same reality in many different planes. You've got the electrons and the bits and the bytes and the information and the program and the graphics program and then the screen. to some degree, you could say reality works that way too. Now, if a computer scientist were to penetrate into the program, they might be very interested in what's going on over there. So if our consciousness in this metaphor can penetrate beyond this outer layer and get into the inner layer, you can interact then in ways that impact the outer layer. You can have the equivalent of giving somebody food in that inner layer. Because when food is being given, something's happening in that world too. So you can have the equivalent of feeding somebody, you can have the equivalent of looking after them. You can enter that prophetic space where everything's metaphor and analogy, but is very real in that space, and really be feeding them food and running around and going to the tent and doing this, that, and the other. But it's occurring in that plane of consciousness, and then it's having a translated effect down here. You could be struggling and wrestling up there. I'll tell you even more than that. The Maharal in the second introduction to the Gevuras Hashem says when Yehoshua in Sefer Yehoshua chapter 10 asks Hashem to keep the sun standing still, he says it's very possible that Amori, who they were fighting, saw the sun setting. Because you have different planes of reality, and normally they all align up, and here God could shift something in one that's not fully translated into the other. And if the Israelite, the Bnei Yisrael, could be on a higher level of consciousness, they could almost see beyond the normal graphics, see into the inner reality. And for them, the sun was standing still, the equivalent obviously going on there. And the Amori world was still dealing with the sun setting. That's what he says. So, in other words, reality is co-occurring upon many planes. And you can have a translation of the same experience through each of those planes. And therefore, you can absolutely, you could be giving stock or giving charity in a physical world, but there's a parallel happening in upper world, upper world, upper world, upper world. And then the positive light that flows immediately through becomes muffled as it comes down to this world, but it's also happening in this world. And so there's a double causal interaction, if you like. And therefore, you absolutely could describe reality on any of those planes, and it'll all be true. But the context of being in, the Rambam would say the simple fact you're in a context of meeting an angel immediately tells you it must be in a prophecy state. And in prophecy states, prophets see real things. Look, the beginning of the book of Hosea, God says to Hosea, take a zonah, a prostitute. I mean, if you read that as a literal story, it's very bizarre. Okay, if God says, do it, do it. But the simplest way to read the story is actually, I mean, the way the Radak reads it, the Rambam for sure reads it, is no, this was inside the prophecy. He was saying, in the prophecy, he must have seen something, right? But imagine he's in this superconscious dream state. In his superconscious dream state, he's aware that God's talking to him, and now God says, do these things in this prophetic dream state, right? And immediately a child's born, and the next child's born. All this happens in the same nevuah. So that's okay. You can have absolutely very, very tangible experiences in that higher state of consciousness.
So he wasn't physically feeding them, he was in that state.
But he was really feeding them.
Like physically he was also?
No, he wasn't physically feeding. According to the Rambam, he wasn't. According to the Ramban, he was absolutely physically feeding them. They penetrated into the outer layer. There's a question is who moved? Did Avram move into the inner layer, or did they move into the outer layer? And then on whatever plane they were interacting, the primary consciousness, the act of feeding, which occurs on every single level in a different way, physical on this level, higher on higher levels, is the one that's being referred to primarily in the Torah. I want to come back to your question. You started with science and Torah back at, why does the Torah not give us a whole long description of the science? Because that's not the important story. The Torah's important story is what are the lessons we're going to learn from the creation story. And also, what I explained to you in the other week is it's very possible, just as I've said now, that the days of creation are being described on a higher plane of reality. That didn't take till modern science for rabbis to be saying. Rashi writes this very clearly on the Torah, that it occurs in the mind of God. Right? The Mekubalim are very clear about this. So we've known this for a very long time. Our assumption was that the most natural translation is probably the events that happened before too, but that was never a very important piece of what we're doing. We don't read the creation story to say, oh, it happened in 6 days in this way. We read the creation story because every single day of creation lays a foundation for where we are. The fact that there's a separation between light and darkness is the rest of the story of human history. The fact that every day goes from Erev to Boker, which we call evening and morning, but literally means chaos to order. The word Erev is always when things are mixed up. That's why an Eruv, where you mix lots of domains into one, or an Eruv, a mixture of food, or an Eruv, Rav, a mixture of people, is always the word. Eruv just means when things are mixed up. And that's because in our world we call the evening that because the sun is setting and everything's becoming mixed up. Boker is levaker, it's clarity. So every stage goes from chaos to order. there's the separation of light and darkness. And each day of creation it's in the second day that reality begins to separate. Right? That's very important to understand the importance of that. In each part of creation, the fact that when God instructs the fruit trees to produce trees that are fruity, even though the fruit is fruity, i.e. the process should be like the outcome. Right, do you know what I'm referring to? And the third day of creation, I'll just digress for a little bit on this. We do need to get back to Hilchos Tshuva at some point. But in the third day of creation, there's this anomaly where God says the earth should produce eitz pri osa pri, which literally means a fruit tree that makes fruit, where there's an obvious redundancy. A fruit tree and a tree that makes fruit are the same thing. So a fruit tree that makes fruit is redundant. When it actually comes out, it comes as an eitz osa pri, a tree that makes fruit, not called a fruit tree that makes fruit. Okay? And the rabbis pick up on this. Again, this going back thousands of years now, we're talking midrashim here. And they say that, that's called the sin of the ground, and in the end of history, the fruit tree will taste like the fruit. And the deep idea is, when God builds into creation the concept of tree, he builds into creation the concept of a process. And everywhere in the natural world there's trees, and everything that eats from the trees and nurtures from them is in a world where there is tree, where there's process, and then there's fruit, there's outcome. In an ideal world, the process would taste like the fruit. That's God's vision. In the actual world, the process does not taste like the fruit, and that's the entry point of free will. So each description of reality is focusing us on the fact that in its translation into the physical world, we can see all the lessons there are. We can see the fact that the tree doesn't taste like the fruit. And that means already now in all of our lives, from that point of creation onwards, everything that develops after that has this same process built in, the struggle between the process not tasting like its outcome. And so on for each day of creation, the moon being reduced, right? Which means that the giving force and the reflective force in the world are not equal. And that's going to be our problem, reflecting the light of God. And every day of creation is working like this. Every single day is the story of the emergence of sin, the emergence of flaws built into creation, the stages through which things come into existence. Those are the things you have to always learn throughout the ages, and that's what we still learn to this day. The fact that then you discover that scientifically this must be referring to the roots of creation rather than the story, or there's a mirror of it built into Maisa Bereshis, all those different things, fine, fair enough. That we've always understood. It's not a new idea in the last few hundred years that God speaks to us through science and God speaks to us through Torah. The Rambam's very clear about this. There's Rashi on the Torah, almost the first Rashi, right? The word Elokim. Why does it say Bereshit bara Elokim, not Bereshit bara Hashem or Hashem Elokim? The beginning arose in the mind of God to create the world as strict justice, saw the world wouldn't come, survive, and therefore he married, partnered with it mercy, and that's how the world came out. So we already know those 7 days are the core structure of reality, not the thing you'll go back in a time machine and find. If you believe Rashi, that shouldn't have been new information to us. Our Rosh Hashanah commemorates the 6th day of creation, not the first day. None of that was new. Modern science didn't force us to reread the Torah in that way.